Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to What's New in Historical Fiction, an author panel that features historical novelists with new and upcoming titles. Today, we have with us Paula Martinak, author of Dear Miss Cushman. We have Dietrich Kaltheis, author of Under an Outlaw Moon. And we have Sarah Loudon Thomas, author of The Finder of Forgotten Things. Before we get to them, let me introduce myself and tell you a little bit about the features here on Crowdcast and what you can expect for the event tonight. First of all, my name is Colin Mustfull. I'm the founder and editor of History Through Fiction, an independent press out of Minneapolis, Minnesota that publishes historical fiction. We are brand new, young press, 3 authors, 4 titles, and hopefully we will grow here into the future. Crowdcast has a chat feature, which I see many of you have found already. It's on the lower right-hand screen of your lower right-hand corner of your screen. Go ahead and interact with people there. Say hello. Let us know where you're from, what you're reading, anything like that you want to share. If you have a question for any of the panelists, there is an Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen. So click Ask a Question and type your question in there. And then if you don't have a question but you want to vote for one that you like, you can open that Ask a Question feature and pick from the list of questions and upvote the ones that you like the most. And then once we get to the Q&A portion of the event, I'll use those questions that have the most votes, and we'll see if we can get through all the votes, all the questions, but that's an option for you. We have a poll question that's also at the bottom of the screen. It's just for fun. So go ahead and feel free to participate in that at any time you like. We have a call to action button. It's the big green button on the bottom of the screen. That's where you can find links to all of our authors' books. It sends you to their publishers' websites. Well, it sends you to the landing page, and then that takes you to the publisher website. But we've got some discount codes there that you can use to purchase these authors' books today. And also, some of the registrants will receive a giveaway, will receive free books. I'll email winners of those free books after the event. And finally, there's a donate button. Thank you very much for those who have already donated to History Through Fiction. This platform, Crowdcast, isn't free, and I'm glad that we're able to bring you events like this. And if you feel like you want and are able to support us, feel free to click that donate button and give us a donation of $5 or less, just to help us keep doing literary events like this. Well, without further ado, let's welcome our panelists. Paula, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your book?
Thanks, Colin. I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for putting this together. I'm Paula Martinak. I'm the author of 7 novels, the last 4 of which have been historical novels. And then my first novel was sort of a historical fantasy ghost story. So I've been doing some form of historical fiction for most of my career. In my day job, I'm a teacher. I work at UNC Charlotte, teaching fiction writing to undergraduates, and I also teach at a place called Charlotte Center for the Literary Arts. I live in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I'm going to be teaching an online writing class called Writing Historical Fiction, of all things. That starts at the end of the month. So that's a little bit about me.
Wonderful. Dietrich, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I live in Vancouver. My book, Under an Outlaw Moon, it's my first true crime story. Well, it's sort of a crime story. That is not totally fiction. I started out writing crime fiction, and then crime fiction became more historical fiction. And this one is sort of based on a true story. So it's something completely different for me. And there you go.
How many books have you published? It's quite a few, isn't it?
This is the 9th one.
Okay, wow. And finally, Sarah, why don't you tell us about yourself and your book?
My book is The Finder of Forgotten Things. I write Appalachian historical. I'm one of, I think there are 3 of us who write Appalachian historical. And I'm actually the 7th generation to grow up on my family's farm in West Virginia. So I'm a longtime mountaineer, hillbilly. I'm allowed to say that. And my books are mostly based, set in West Virginia. And I talk about writing recent historicals because my books are primarily 20th century. I've gone back as far as the 1930s because the Depression era is just fun. And a lot of my stories are really based in family stories and those kinds of things. So The Finder of Forgotten Things, number 7, is based around a historical event in West Virginia. The worst industrial accident in U.S. history happened in West Virginia, and hardly anyone knows about that. So the story is about a water dowser, and it centers around that tragedy. So it was interesting to take a really tragic story and then try to redeem it in some way. So it was a powerful journey for me to write this story.
And I have a particular interest in Sarah's book because I went to college in West Virginia, and my sister lives in Roanoke, Virginia. So I've spent a lot of time in Appalachia, in that area. One question I do have for all of you, and this is a common question I'm sure you get, is what inspired your story? So, Sarah, you just mentioned the disaster that's your story centers upon. So, can you tell us? Well, first, a little summary of your book, and then what inspired you to write about that topic?
Well, when I'm living in Asheville, North Carolina, so just up the mountain from Paula, and when I drive home to West Virginia, I go through Hawk's Nest, the New River Gorge area of West Virginia, and I would stop there. And actually, I really learned about Hawk's Nest because there's the New River Gorge Bridge, it used to be the longest single span expansion bridge in the world. Now I think there's 1 or 2 others that are longer, but it is a long bridge, and it is high, like 2 Empire State Buildings will fit underneath this bridge. And at some point I got freaked out. And so I started taking a detour to avoid the bridge. And the detour to avoid the bridge takes you through Hawk's Nest, West Virginia. And there are all these, the historical markers. When you're a historical writer, you stop and you actually read those historical markers on the side of the road. And there are all these stories about the worst industrial disaster in the United States. And I said, man, this is so interesting. And and what happened is that they were drilling a tunnel so that they could divert the New River to create hydroelectric power. And they drilled it through rock that was... Shh, I'm so sorry. my dog. They were drilling it through rock that was in places over 96% up to like 99% silica. And if you know anything about silica, that's what you make glass out of. And these men were breathing in silica dust, and it caused silicosis. And men were dying within months because there was no safety equipment. There was no protection. And I said, man, I just have to work this into a story. So I have a water dowser who's a bit of a ne'er-do-well. He's on the run because he's basically taken a town for all their money. He said he could find water. He didn't find water, ran off with their money. And he stumbles upon Hawk's Nest in the middle of this tragedy happening. And he begins to realize that there are more important things in life than getting his few dollars and moving on. So it's hard to write a story with a happy... I always promise my readers I'm going to have at least a if not happy, a satisfying ending. And that was a little harder this time around, but I think I did it. You read it and let me know.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad to hear someone say that they stop and read those road signs, because sometimes I think nobody ever does. I'm the only one there. But yeah, those can inspire some research and some stories, and sounds like that's definitely what you did.
Yeah.
Dietrich, I was curious to know more about Benny and Stella Mae Dixon. I was surprised that I didn't know anything about them myself, which is maybe why you did some of the research and writing that you did. So tell us about Stella and Benny Dixon, and what inspired you to write about them.
I was doing some research for another novel, also set sort of during the Dust Bowl times, and there was a rainmaker in that one, not a douser, but he actually said he could make rain, and he didn't. But anyway, I stumbled upon the story and read a little bit about them, and I thought, wow, it sounds like Bonnie and Clyde, but nobody's ever heard of them. I ended up doing quite a bit of research on them, and they robbed 2 banks. Nobody was injured. They're newlyweds. She had just turned 16, so quite naive. But they made it to the top of the FBI's most wanted list and became the subject of a nationwide manhunt, wanted dead or alive. And I thought, wow, just from that, I mean, if you look at the history of Dillinger or Bonnie and Clyde or Carpus or any of those people, they were notorious. They, left, all kinds of people dead, and robbed many places. I think Dillinger robbed 24 banks, and he even robbed 4 police stations took all their weapons, and so on and so on. And these 2 did, it's certainly not the best choices, I guess, but they robbed 2 banks and ended up being hunted down. And I thought, well, there's a story there.
And I'm sorry, what did you say you were researching to begin with?
I was researching for another book called Call Down the Thunder. And it was set in more or less the same time period. And a lot of the research, old photographs and newspapers, actually entire newspapers and so on. And I came upon this headline, and it just sort of led me into the story. So I was going to sort of put it aside, and I guess it was probably almost 2 years later I started writing it.
Yeah, it's definitely very interesting, especially hearing how young Stella was, and surprising that they were on the FBI top 10, most wanted list.
Yeah, it was a story I didn't have to make up.
Now that's nice about historical fiction sometimes, is a lot of the material is there in the research.
It's even better than what you can make up.
Yeah. Paula, why don't you tell us about what inspired your story and some of the research you did for it?
Sure. So my most recent novel, it's right here. It's Dear Miss Cushman. And like Sarah, I had mostly written historical fiction that took place in the 20th century. And I decided that I wanted to do something much earlier and to really challenge myself in that way. And so this story takes place in the 1850s in Manhattan. I have long been a student of LGBTQ history, and I'm very interested in the idea that there were women who loved other women and lived with other women at a time when the word lesbian was not in use, when there was not lesbian identity. And that there were men who loved other men and lived with them and made lives with them at that same time. And so that's always been sort of intriguing to me. And there is this actual historical figure named Charlotte Cushman, who's in the title, but she's not the subject of my book, but she makes a cameo appearance. But she was a very, very famous actress of her day, equivalent to the Booth family. She was a superstar. She was kind of like, if you think about, she was referred to just as Charlotte, you know, in the way that we might talk about Cher or Gaga or Madonna or something like that. And she is not really known today. She sort of went into obscurity, mostly because she did live with other women and made her life with other women. And she made her career playing what were called breeches roles. And these are roles that would be like, the role of Romeo was a role that she played in male costume. And she didn't do it it wasn't for laughs or for anything like that. She did it very seriously and did it extremely well. And she was very well known for that. So anyway, I became intrigued with this idea of what were women like that like when they were young. And so I decided, you know, like what would a teenage Charlotte Cushman be like? And I had also read that Charlotte Cushman had a lot of fans. She had a lot of very young fans who wrote her letters. And from that, it's where my protagonist, Georgiana Cartwright, came from. She's 18 years old. Her father is a renowned actor, but he disgraces himself and deserts his family. He disgraces himself on stage by performing drunk. And Georgie is left to try to make a living so that she can support her family. And she is going to try her life on the stage, which was one of the best careers for women who wanted to be independent at that time. You could actually make a lot of money. Charlotte Cushman became very rich. So the story follows her path onto the stage and the trials and tribulations that she faces as she also tries to make her way in these breeches roles.
Yeah, I love that for each one of your books, I didn't know anything about these people or events. And, you know, I think that's what these stories do, is it brings them to life. But Paula, I'm interested to know more about the message that you want to convey, because in addition to sharing about important history, I think as authors, we also want to make a conclusion, give a message, have something that resonates with people. And I read a review by Amber Smith that called your story unapologetically queer and deeply empowering. Talk about how important that is to you and how you were able to accomplish something like that.
Yeah, I'm very, I'm devoted to writing about LGBTQ history, and mostly because it's because it has been hidden for such a long time. It was hidden. Same-sex relationships have been around for centuries, for as long as we know. Gender nonconformity has been around for as long as we know, and yet they were criminalized. They're not taught in schools. So I was trained in history. I went to graduate school in history, and though I didn't want to be a historian, this is a way that I can help get these hidden stories, bring them to life, as you say. Because LGBTQ people, even though they didn't have that identity in past centuries, they existed, and I think, you know, it's important for young people and for people who have not known about this history to know about it. So that's a very important part of my writing, and something that is sort of foremost for me. And it's not that I'm writing coming out stories, but it's just that the characters are queer, and it talks about, you know, I like to talk about how that impacted people's lives and how they were able to make their own way.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I applaud you for that. And it's definitely interesting to hear about it in the setting of the 1850s, and certainly someone as interesting as Charlotte and being in those breeches roles. And yeah. Sarah, you talked about creating a satisfying story, if nothing else. So talk about the message of your story. I'm also curious to know more about Sullivan Harris and Jeremiah Weber. Are they fictional characters? And then what role do they play in helping you convey that message?
Well, Sullivan Harris, he's the water dowser. We open with Sully, uh, basically running off with some people's money, and the inspiration for him was my great uncle Selly. His name was actually Marcellus, but everybody called him Selly and mispronounced it Sully, so I just went with that. And he was quite a character. He didn't have a house of his own. This was in rural West Virginia, and he would actually just roam the woods in the community, and he might knock on anybody's door of an evening and just come in and have dinner. And my great Aunt Bess and my great Uncle Willis actually remembered him, and said that he would turn up at their dinner table, and I would just sit there at the table, and he would draw pictures after supper. And one day I was talking to my Aunt Bess, I said, "What did he draw pictures of?" And she said, "Naked women or the devil." That was it. And one time my Uncle Willis asked him, he said, "Well, how do you know what the devil looks like?" And Sully said, "Seen him many a time." And I was like, this is the kind of, these are the stories that I grew up with that really populate my characters and my fiction. But so I toned Sully down a little bit for this book. He's not quite the rapscallion that my great uncle really was. And then Jeremiah Weber is kind of the other side of the coin, where he's the good man. He's the man everybody turns to in the community when they need a helping hand. He's the one who is kind of the self-appointed rescuer for everybody. And so he's the one who's sent after Sully when he runs off with the money to track him down and either bring him back to dig a well or get their money back. And what was fun, and I didn't really anticipate this when I started writing the story, is they become good friends, sort of unexpectedly for both of them. And the message that I wanted to get through, the reason it's titled The Finder of Forgotten Things is because Sully feels forgotten. He's an orphan. He's wandering through life. He doesn't really put down roots anywhere, and he feels like he's forgotten. And then he finds this tragedy happening where a big part of it was that there was a large Black population that came for these jobs during the Great Depression and died in the tunnel and were buried anonymously in a cornfield in Somersville, West Virginia. And they're forgotten. And they've kind of been forgotten over and over again over the years. And throughout even after the story is closed, I've been to the cemetery where they relocated these men. They don't know who they were. And just that sense of being forgotten. I think so many of us feel, especially these days when we've just been through these past 2 years, we feel alone and isolated and forgotten in a lot of ways. And so a big part of the story, the message of the story is just, love your neighbor, whoever your neighbor is, love them, because we're all so in need of that and so hungry for that. And it breaks down so many barriers between people who kind of shouldn't get along, or might not think they would get along. It's just love your neighbor. That's 3 words.
Yeah. Well, it's a great message and such a fun and interesting way to get to it, through these characters that you have. And of course, through the real people, that inspired you from your life. That's amazing.
I got to tell you one more, Sully. He said he wanted to be buried in a chestnut coffin. Chestnut wood has a lot of sap in it. And if you burn chestnut wood, the sap will kind of explode. And he said he wanted to be buried in a chestnut coffin so he could go to hell a-poppin'.
Yeah, it sounds like you're making that up, but we'll take your word for it.
If I am, it should be true.
Yeah. Well, Dietrich, in your novel, I was especially interested about Stella. The book opens in a roller rink, and she's 15 years old. It just shows that innocence there. And of course, Benny's an interesting character too, having just gotten out of jail and he's got big plans for his life. So talk about their innocence, and also I'm curious, are they protagonists or are they villains? How do you think they should be perceived, and what's the overall message you want to get across?
In writing it, I didn't have a message I wanted to get across. I guess if there is a message in the book, it's the crime didn't fit the punishment. I started the scene and that actually is how they met, in a roller rink. And yeah, I wanted to show their innocence, and I did see them as protagonists. I mean, they rob banks. Okay, that's certainly criminal, but nobody was hurt. And actually, there's an interesting story in the second bank, as in the first. There were time locks on the vaults, and both banks, they walked in and the time locks were set, so the vaults nobody could open them. Combination's not going to help you, anything like that. The first one, they had to wait about 20 minutes. And they did. They waited it out. No alarms were tripped. I mean, it wouldn't work like that today. The second time, I think it was about an hour and a half or an hour 45. I'm sorry, I forget. And so he posed as a bank inspector, stood behind the counter. His shotgun is there, his pistol is there, out of sight from the customers. About 50 people came in and did their banking business and walked back out. So I mean, it's very characterful. I mean, to be that cool through all of that, and nobody was injured. There's at one point, one of the clerks in the bank, they were waiting for this time lock to pop, and Benny saw a coat on a rack, and he wasn't going to get time to go shopping in the next little while because he was going to be on the run. But he asked how much for the coat, and so the fellow sold him the coat, and Benny paid him with the bag, took money from the cash drawer and paid him for it. So really interesting, but in all of that, I guess the point is, like, nobody was injured, and they became the subject of a coast-to-coast manhunt. So I did see them as protagonists throughout the story.
Yeah.
Did I answer the question? Because I kind of went.
They're very polite indeed. Yeah. So Stella, she lived a long life, right? But Benny did not. Is that right?
That's right. Yes. I guess that's not a spoiler. You can.
Yeah. You can Wikipedia that.
The interesting with Stella was how naive she was and I guess forgivably, she was enamored with Benny, who was 25 when they met. But she does grow. There's quite an arc to her character throughout the story, and then at the end you see her as much older and far wiser than she was when she started out. So
yeah. Well, before I move on to my next question, I just want to remind people that we have this ask a question feature on the bottom. So if you do come up with a question that you want to ask the panelists, just type that into the ask a question on the bottom, and we'll get to that in just a little bit. But next I want to go to Paula, and this is really for all of you. But Paula, you're a playwright, and your novel takes place in the theater. I'm wondering if you leaned on your own experience in order to share the story, and then for all of you, after Paula speaks, did you also rely in some way on your own experience, your own background, in order to create more depth in your story and your characters?
It was very helpful to me to have written plays and to have plays produced. I had a break in between. I wrote 3 novels and then had sort of a break from fiction writing. And my spouse and I moved to Pittsburgh, where there wasn't a big fiction writing community, but there was a huge playwriting community. And so I got involved with a playwriting group and a small theater company, and had a bunch of plays produced there in the time that we lived there. And it's amazing, the lingo of the theater hasn't really changed very much over time. So that was very helpful to me in terms of picturing how people moved around on the stage. And I've never been an actor, but I've worked very closely with them, having plays produced. And also one of my characters, Clementine, is a playwright. So I felt very comfortable writing about her as well. And when I was doing research, there aren't very many 19th century theaters, physical theaters left anymore. But there is one in Wilmington, North Carolina. And I went and visited it and could stand on the stage and feel how it felt to have the stage sloping a little. And so that was very cool for me as well, to actually go and stand on a stage like the one that Georgie and her friends might have been on.
Yeah, wow. Sarah or Dietrich, anything from your own experience that you were able to add more depth into your novels?
You know what? I always try to tell a story from the point of view of the characters, and their beliefs are not necessarily my own way of looking at things, whether they're made up or in this case they were real. But I did flesh them out. So I try not to interject any of myself into that, but I don't know that you can really help it. I'm sure something always creeps in. Maybe I'm not even aware of it, but how I might see that or give the character a perspective that is my own, and but not intentionally.
One thing for me with the water dowsing, a lot of my stories have a touch of magical realism in them. And my editor and I were talking about this story and this idea. And he said, well, why don't you, I was talking about what that element might be. And he said, well, why don't you make Sully a water dowser? And I said, well, we're talking about magical realism. He's like, yeah. I said, oh, I grew up around people who doused for a well. Like that's how you found a well on your property, is you got a bent coat hanger and you went out, or if you were really serious, you got a willow or I can't remember the other, peach. Peach is a popular wood. You got a stick and you douse for water. And it had never occurred to me that it was not science. And some people will argue that it is science, that you need a young limber twig that you've just stripped off the tree because the branch will actually be drawn to the water underground. And there's talk about the planets and the moons, but it was kind of funny to me that it just seemed like such a natural thing to me that you would douse for water if you needed water, that I didn't think of that as being a little bit of magical realism. But what I did to kind of make it seem more that way, Sully, he doesn't think it works. He's a little bit of a fraud, and he's doing this as a way to bilk people out of their money. So it does work in the book, and he's
surprised.
A little bit. He's surprised by that.
Well, certainly for something like that, if you want your characters to believe it, that it doesn't hurt if you believe it too, at least, or have experienced it. So at History Through Fiction, obviously the name is in our title. We try to balance history and fiction, and it's a challenging task for someone who hasn't done it before to understand that. And I mean, from my perspective, I started in history before moving to fiction, and so the historical process is really important to me. Citations being as objective as possible, but you can't exactly do that in fiction. And so I'm always trying to strike a balance between getting the facts in there without disrupting the dream, the narrative, the fictional plot. So talk about in your books, maybe were there some historical facts you had to leave out, or were there some historical facts that you had to alter a little bit in order to fit the story, make it more plausible? So talk about that experience. Dietrich, why don't you start?
I think I've got like a clock in my head, and I'm very mindful of pace when I'm working through drafts. So, when you compile all this really interesting history, you really have to sift through, well, I do anyway, sift through what do you need and what don't you need. And I always picture the scenes like I'm there. And so I see what is there. And maybe I'll describe the way a car starts or something like that. And you've got to research all of this too, because of the cars from the 30s or 20s or something like that. You don't hit a remote, it's a little different. So you have to find out all these things, but you want to be careful what stays in, what doesn't, or the story that the scene just starts to drag. And it starts to sound more like a history book than a novel.
Yeah. Well, I like that statement you said, what do you need and what don't you need? And as you mentioned, you have so much research that you have to sift through, and it would be wonderful to include all of it. But then, what serves the story and what doesn't?
Sometimes subtle things too, like just through dialogue, through characters speaking to each other. And you can just put a little bit of something that's from history in it, just to root it, just to make it believable, without really getting into a lot of detail. So, and I mean, if somebody wants to find out more about whatever it is, they can look it up, the story keeps moving forward.
Paula, how about you? Did you have to leave some things out, change some things?
Yeah, sure. I wasn't writing about, I was writing about an era, and I feel strongly about certain things that, I wouldn't write a novel about women playing breeches roles if they didn't do it anymore at that time or something like that. But I feel fine about fudging the small things. Like there really was a tour that Charlotte Cushman was on in 1852, and I used that in the book. But, there are small things when I want to have her come back and make a cameo appearance. Well, she probably wasn't back in New York at the particular time that I put her there. And I feel fine about things like that. It's like what has to be believable for your world, the world that you're creating. And I needed her to be back in New York at that time. And, it's not the actual Charlotte Cushman. It's Charlotte Cushman as I imagine her, or as I imagine that she moved around in the world. So I feel fine about that. But yeah, there's years and years ago, I took a historical fiction workshop with Meredith Tax, who wrote Rivington Street and a lot of other great novels. And she said, and I never forgot it, that you do this enormous amount of research, and 90% of it never gets into the book. It's that you absorb it so that you know the world and can live in the world and be able to convey it. And it's only those, 10%, the little details, as Dietrich said, that you can slip in every now and then. And I'm really, I'm not really a proponent. There was a lot in this book that will be unfamiliar to people. And I really like articles of clothing, for example. A pelerine was like a little shawl that women wore, and a little lace shawl, and a reticule would be a little handbag. But I felt very strongly about not defining those terms, but just showing them being used so that it would feel very, very natural in the way that people would think about them at the time, rather than here's my little reticule, it's a purse, or something like that. So trying to make it very natural, and to talk about these things that are unfamiliar to us today in the way that people would have talked about them then.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because a lot of TV shows, historical TV shows I watch now, it's nowadays, they don't make it natural. They just
Right.
throw in a song that was popular at that time, or anything cultural. So yeah, it's important, and it's probably challenging to make sure you don't just plop it in there, but that it fits the time period, it fits the story, and yeah, it's not easy to do. Sarah, how about you?
There were so many details that I wanted to include in this story. Things like there was an account of the men working in the tunnels and coming out, and they would talk about they would blow their nose and it looked like toothpaste. That's how bad the dust was. And I actually found a way to work that in, where Sully meets a man who's come out of the tunnel, and he's like, he blows his nose. He's like, yeah, it's just like they said, toothpaste. What I did in this story that I had not done before was an author's note section at the end, where I included some of those things that didn't naturally flow into the story, and also gave some references for additional reading, because there's some really, really great literature around this that I thought would be interesting additional reading for folks. My first novels were historical, but they were completely fictional, made up town. They were family stories, so I didn't really have to worry about. I was doing research for the era, but not so much historical things that actually happened. The first time I wrote a book that was set in a real place with real history was When Silence Sings, 2 books ago, and I intentionally set it in Thurmond, West Virginia, because that was the town it was known as the Dodge City of the East in the 20s and 30s. And today there are 7 residents of Thurmond, West Virginia. It's the town. It's a ghost town. It's owned by the Park Service in West Virginia. And I thought, I'm going to set my first historical fiction in a real historical place in a town where there are only 7 people to take issue with anything that I get wrong. It was so much fun to set a story in a place where I could go. Like, I called up the Park Service and I said, I want to come see this ghost town. And a park ranger took me down there and unlocked buildings and showed me all these places. And I'm hoping, Paula and Dietrich, that you've had the opportunity to step into your stories that way, where you go visit the place you're writing about. And it's indescribable how much fun it is to walk around inside your story.
Yeah. That beats Google every time.
Yeah.
Oh, hands down. You can do street view is awesome, but it does not compare to actually going.
No, not at all.
Well, yeah, that's one of the great things about historical fiction is a lot of the places are still available to you to visit, whether it's just a road sign or a ghost town or something like that. And Paula, you had mentioned going on stage in those old theaters, and yeah. Well, I've got one more. We've got one more question for all of you, and then I'll move on to some questions from the audience. I'm really curious. All of you are accomplished writers in more than one genre, numerous titles out there. But I'm assuming that your books haven't made you rich, which can be the assumption that you write a book and it gets made into a movie and all of a sudden you're living the high life. Well, that's not necessarily the case. So
we're just all really humble and keeping it on the low down.
So talk about your journey as a writer. What keeps you going? And also some of the pitfalls, what gets to be a little bit depressing at times. So what's the difference? What happens with you as far as the pitfalls and the rewards of being a full-time author with many titles and just keep working at. Paula, why don't you start for us?
Sure. Well, I think the biggest challenge for me as a writer is always time to write, because I'm not a full-time writer. I write part-time. I also teach fiction writing. And that tends to come first because that's, as you said, I haven't gotten rich from my fiction writing. But this book in particular, I had a really good year, the year that I wrote Dear Miss Cushman, and it was kind of unheard of because I got 2 fellowships in the same year. And so it makes such a huge difference to writers and artists to get funding. This one was funded in particular by a fellowship from the Arts and Science Council in Charlotte. And so it was really a joy to write because I didn't have to think about, I could teach fewer classes. I didn't have to teach in the summer. There were all those kinds of things that were really great. And as I told people, we had a little fellowship group and we had to talk about what was the greatest part of getting the fellowship. And I said, it made me feel like a kid again, because when I was little, I started writing when I was 7. And, when you're little and you're writing, you're not thinking about, is this going to sell, or, how am I going to market this or something? It's just the sheer joy of writing. And it took me back to that. And that was an absolute joy. And that's, Dear Miss Cushman, for that reason, will always have a really special place for me because of that.
Nice.
Oh, I love that, Paula. The freedom of writing. And I also have my day job, the job that pays the bills. And I love that job too. I work doing fundraising for a children's ministry. But the writing for me is like, you have a terrible day at work. Things are hard. You can't control everything. You come home and you sit down at your laptop and you have complete control. You can make these people do whatever you want.
Yeah.
It's like
Right.
one part of your life where it's going to go the way you want it. And okay, I say it's going to go the way you want it to go. Every now and again, you're like, what just happened with that paragraph, that chapter? But for me, I come from such a storytelling background. My family are storytellers. My husband, it drives him crazy because I'll come home from the grocery store and he'll say, oh, how was the store? And I'm like, well, let me tell you what happened in the checkout line. And there's this big story. It's just my nature to tell stories. And so the joy of being able to sit down and do that and have someone read it. There's not like, I'm no best-selling author. I'm no John Grisham with hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people reading my stories, but people do read them. And they send me an email and they say, well, I really love this, or this part touched me. And y'all, all people out there listening, write to your favorite authors. Let them know that you read their books. And I'm not just talking about reviews, but to hear from someone who says, I read it and I enjoyed it and it impacted me in some way. You're just like, well, that's all I need. I will write you another one.
Yeah, it's so nice to hear you talk about that, and yeah, writers are more accessible than ever, of course. And I'm always surprised when I reach out to an author and it's like, oh, they you can talk to them, and
like, oh my gosh, there are people.
Yeah.
We're sitting alone in a room somewhere over a laptop, and have to have interactions with people who are actually reading our stories is wonderful.
So, Dietrich, what are some of your challenges and rewards of the writing life?
Well, I think like Paula and Sarah said, it's not a challenge if it's a joy to do it. And I do it every day, and I just feel fortunate to be able to do it. And I don't let anything interfere with that. And I think staying positive, at least as far as the story goes, I usually can't wait. I just start very early in the morning. And I can't wait to get started. There's always something that I just get right into. I don't sit there and wonder, oh, what am I going to do now? It's there, it's waiting. So I think for me that's everything is the pure joy of doing it. And I think if that's there, then it doesn't matter how many books you sold last week, you know.
Yeah, I find that
Any idea?
I have a hard time bringing myself to the writing desk, but once I'm there and I've got the pencil in hand and I start doing it, then I'm like, well, what was I so afraid of this?
Mm-hmm.
Enjoy it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Let me get to some of the questions here by the audience. So we have Tony asks, is it ever difficult to fact check when you're writing historical fiction? Does that determine what your subject will be? And I guess that also brings up what kind of anachronistic things maybe your editor had to catch. Did you do your own fact checking, or was it an editor or someone else, a trusted friend that was able to help you with that?
I had one where my editor tried to fact check something, and I was like, no, this is right. I was writing a book. It was in a series, and this was the 1970s. And I had, there were two things. One character was wearing a bed jacket. She was sick and she was in bed. And he's like, people don't wear bed jackets. I said, I can show you where you can order a bed jacket online today. And then I had a character in the 1970s churning butter. And he's like, well, who churned butter in the 1970s? I was like, me. My mom was still churning butter in the 80s. We lived on a farm in West Virginia. And that's what and of course now it's trendy again. But he was trying to accuse me of an anachronism, but he was wrong.
Yeah. Well, that happens when you're writing a novel. You're the expert. You've done so much research, and yeah, sometimes people make assumptions about history that you have more experience with. Paula or Dietrich, what kind of fact checking did you do?
I think speaking to people is always probably the best way. Getting personal accounts, reading personal accounts, old letters, that sort of thing, getting a flavor of something. With Google, it's a little dicey sometimes, depending what you're fact checking, but you can fact check 3 different facts and they're all about the same thing, yet they're all different. So I try to do that as much as I can myself, and a copy editor later will do it again and usually catches something that, well, this isn't exactly the way it was. It's more like this, and I'll go and check again, and wow, he's right. And you try to get it as right as you can. But
Paula, I want to ask you a question. You were talking about writing 20th century fiction. Okay, the reason I started writing 20th century fiction is because my research at that point was mostly picking up the phone and calling my dad and saying, what kind of stove did grandma cook on?
Yeah.
So was there any of that for you?
They're really in the 20th century books. No, not really. Yeah, there wasn't any of that. But the 20th century is so much easier because there's TV and there's there's radio and there's stuff that you don't have in the 19th century. So I just did an enormous amount of fact checking myself, and I had things like, I was thinking about the language. I was very concerned about that because I didn't want it to be stiff language, but I didn't want them to use anything that they wouldn't have used. And so I found this great book. Bartlett did quotations that we all know about Bartlett's quotations, but he also did a dictionary of Americanisms that was published in the mid 19th century. And so, so I could see that people actually did use the word okay, which I didn't know that okay would have been in usage in 1852, but it would have. It was slang for sure, but and would have been used by a certain class of people. But I could see that and I could pepper some of my characters' dialogue with that. So I don't think I mean I have readers all the way along who sometimes catch things or will question things and make me go back and check them, and also the copy editor does a lot of that. But I've done, by the time it gets to them, I've done, I think, a pretty thorough job of checking and double checking things myself to make sure that they're not going to be wrong.
Yeah. If anything gets through, readers will definitely let you know.
Yeah, that's for sure.
But
Well,
it's good to go ahead.
I had one. I did purposely do something in my novel, the Ada Decades, where I fudged a little bit on the date of when the musical The Music Man was first, when the soundtrack was first released or something like that. I fudged on that, and the copy editor called me out and said, "Oh, this wouldn't have been the case. She was a theater maven," and so I had to put it in my author's note that I knew that, this was 6 months too early, but it was just too good not to use it. So so there have been times where I've been called out, but I said, no, I'm gonna do it anyway, and I'll just tell you that I did it and that I know.
Author's notes are the best.
Yeah, I love author's notes. They're great.
Yeah, it definitely allows for transparency. Well, that hour absolutely flew by. This has been a lot of fun, and I'm so glad that we were able to do this, and that Sarah was able to stay on with us the whole time. And we just had one interruption from her dog, so you'll have to scold your dog later.
Where's
so
the
thank
dog?
you.
Oh, hi.
Hello.
Hi.
A little shy, maybe.
Yeah.
She thinks cameras will steal her soul or something. It's not like being on camera.
But before we go, let me just remind readers that if they click on the Get Your Book Now at the bottom, they can find these authors' books and get a discount using the discount code posted on the landing page. Also, look for a follow-up email. Some of you will be winners of an e-copy of these books.
Yeah.
And I guess last thing before we go, the question is, what advice do you have for beginning writers? So any last words from each of you, and any last advice?
Read a lot.
Read a lot, definitely.
And then write a lot.
And start writing. Don't get bogged down in the research. I had a student I was coaching once, and she would come to our meetings with big binders full of research. And it's just at some point you just got to start writing, and the research won't stop. You'll find that you don't know things as you go along, and you have to go back, but you just got to start.
I think that's especially common of people writing historical fiction, because one of the reasons we write historical fiction is that we love history. And you start researching history, and then you find something over here that's interesting and something over there that's interesting. Somebody asked me one time, have you run out of story ideas? What else are you going to write about? I was like, are you kidding me? I have, look around you, read the markers on the side of the road. You're going to have more stories than you could ever possibly tell. So yeah, the temptation can be to just keep coming up with the next story instead of writing this one.
Yeah, it can be hard to stay focused on a topic as the research branches out. Yeah. Well, once again, thank you to everyone who attended. Thank you to our panelists. This event has been recorded. It will be available. I'll put it up on YouTube, and it will be available at this link for replay. And also look for our next What's New in Historical Fiction. I'm planning it out right now, but it'll be probably late January. So hopefully all of you can join us then. So, wow, thank you guys so much. This was great.
Thank you. Thanks for putting it together. Thank you.
It was a blast.
All right.
Take
Bye now.
care.
All right.